I'm with today, to my excitement and surprise, my old friend Nigel Topping, who is nowadays the United Nations High-Level Climate Action Champion, which basically means he's trying to pull together COP26. So, Nigel, you've been doing an extraordinary amount of work the last few months, getting the message over. And as I said a minute ago, fantastic work, by the way. The message is really cutting through. I want to talk to you about a couple of issues that you're seeing and how you see it. I want to talk about first, all these 2030 targets. We've had a fantastic season, if you like, of increased commitments by major economies of the world to 2030, not 2050 targets. What do you see as the import? How's this going to flow through? What does it mean?
Well, I think we've really passed an inflection point in the last 12 months with major economies, but also major economic actors like businesses, investors, and we can talk about some of those signs of momentum, all agreeing that we've got to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest, or as soon as possible. The latest IPCC report kind of just re-ups the clarity of how important every fraction of a degree in every year it is. But I think that's been happening gradually, but really taken off in the last 12 months since the 2018 report on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. I think in the last sort of 6 months, what we've really seen is everybody saying, okay, great, we've got to get to net zero in the 2040s. But what really matters is what we do now. So what's the plan for the next 5 years or 10 years? There's no CEO or no mayor and very few heads of government will be in office in the 2030s. All right, let alone the 2040s. So saying what your fifth successor is going to do in the 2040s is kind of meaningless. So, and I think there's a growing realization that the shape of change, sector after sector, is or will soon be exponential. And so it's not just a question of following the science or of doing the right thing or following the policy. It's increasingly a competitive issue because these are complicated transitions in nearly every sector. But when they take off, they go lightning fast. And if you're running to catch up, you can maybe never catch up. I mean, I was just remembering, the first time, it must be 10 years ago when we first met and you were thinking about the idea of promoting climate bonds, right, before you launched the Climate Bonds initiative. And I think the momentum that you've seen from the first ideas to the first World Bank bond to, what was it? It's only 4 years ago we reached the world reached 100 billion. It's been your crusade. And what are we, so that's and that exponential curve is an example, right? Yep. Of how, and that will keep going, I think, because it's exponential, but it's still very small compared to the world of bonds, right? So I think it's increasingly becoming about competitiveness and the need for speed in the transition to stay alive competitively as an economic actor.
In fact, one of the underpinnings of the green bond market, which will get to about $2 trillion outstanding soon, so it's becoming material, is this understanding of risk. And what we see is a recognition that if you're issuing a green bond, you're doing something to stay ahead of the curve. Now, that ahead of the curve is leading towards lower volatility. The second market, green bonds actually have a lower volatility factor than ordinary bonds. So if you like, safer, more secure investments for investors are correlated with the green transformation. This is what's beginning to happen in markets. But what do investors need to know to stay ahead of this curve? I mean, when you look at transitions, you mentioned that a minute ago, where do you think the big things are beginning to happen now? Like looking at the next few years, what's the chatter you're hearing about rapid change?
Well, first thing is investors need to review their history of industrial transformations and their economic and their exponential mathematics, and be very, very wary of the usual suspects in terms of forecasters of the future. I mean, the IEA central scenario forever has been rubbish in terms of being a predictor of the future. Now they've had this normative scenario of a 1.5 degree scenario, which actually will be much more helpful because that's what the world is trying to do, is actually pull all the levers to get to 1.5. Even Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I always criticize them. They've been slightly more punchy than than the IEA, but still, I think even in the, every year they up the percentage that they think is going to be EVs by 2040, but they're still saying it's going to be only like 61%. I mean, look, the costs are coming down. All the levers are ramping up. The internal combustion engine is dead in the next 10 to 15 years. Mercedes announced net zero 2039 2 years ago. The CEO's just said they're going to go for it by 2030. So every single thing you see is ratcheting, which is a sign of the exponential nature of the change dawning on people. So I think that renewables and power, renewables and transport are reasonably well understood now, although I think they'll continue to surprise people by how fast they go. I think it's in some of the other sectors that have had less attention that things are starting to get really interesting. Steel is something that I think is really, 2 years ago, the steel industry was like, we're hard to abate, we'll go at a kind of reasonable pace. They thought they could manage the pace. They've realized now that it's competitive. It's a market. Yep. Hello, funny. It's you can't dictate the pace of change. You've got car companies and construction companies and mayors saying they only want to buy green steel in the future. So just in the last few months, we've seen H2 Green Steel in northern Sweden, investing in 5 million tons of hydrogen reduced steel. Now ArcelorMittal started to announce their first. I think the first one was a couple of weeks ago in Spain. These are not little demonstration projects. These are 2 million, 5 million ton steel mills. And so cement too is becoming a real hotbed of innovation. And shipping and aviation similarly. But I think the key there is that this is the decade of getting the cost down on the technologies, which are going to be deployed at real scale in the 30s. So that's the thing to be keeping an eye on. Who's investing now to get commercial scale facilities up and running to drive the cost down? And those are the people who'll be then running ahead in the second half of this decade and next decade, I think.
So that's a good tip for everyone out there, by the way, from Nigel. You just heard who's doing the big commercial investments, taking the bets on these areas. I mean, a rapid change is always risky, isn't it, Nigel? I mean, that's the difficulty of it. And the question is, how much do we need governments or public sector agencies or development banks to step in with some risk mitigation to ensure the change goes through smoothly? Is that agenda growing? Do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, I always like to say it's easy to say you've got to go fast, but there's only two ways you can get these kind of rapid transitions wrong. One is going too slow and the other is going too fast. And it's always been the way with investing in change, right? I think, a lot of what we're trying to do with the race to zero is publish sectoral pathways. I mean, we're trying to converge all the great work that's being done by the Energy Transitions Commission, by Mission Possible, by the Danish government, by people doing sectoral pathways. Because what we strongly believe, and I think history shows, is that what Moore's law is a good case in point, is when we have a kind of normative goal, then everybody goes for it and it de-risks it for everybody. So I'll give you a very specific example from the work we've been doing in the last 2 years in shipping. There's some really good collaborations under Mission Possible, the Getting to Zero Coalition, the Global Maritime Forum, bringing together all the sort of actors around the value chain. What we did with them was work to agree that the 2030 goal, to your first point about short-term action, is that we need to get 5% of international shipping to be zero carbon. That doesn't seem like much, given we've got to get it to 100%, but at the moment it's zero, and no one's built the ships, and it's very expensive. So what we've done is basically drawn the normative S-curve, which gets us to 100% in the 2040s, and then said, okay, the waypoint we're aiming for is 5%. So now the whole of that coalition, so there's hundreds of companies, investors, technology providers, ports, are all focused on that goal. And Mission Innovation, which is the public sector innovation play. 23 governments, more than 80% of world public investment in R&D have committed to the same goal. So you've got public sector and private sector all going to the same goal. So it de-risks it for everybody. And I actually think that means we'll nearly always get there faster, because when we really apply ourselves, we're unbelievable innovation machines. Right, and one of the things I find a bit strange about this pathway is that we see very few governments really backing their industry. There's a lot of, well, we'll only commit to what we know we can do, rather than a moonshot mentality, which is like, if we commit big, then we'll drive innovation and that will drive competitiveness. And actually, I think in a quiet way, that's what China's done in sector after sector, right? So,
well, I mean,
they've just got on with going big, right? And then suddenly they dominate the world market, solar, wind, EVs, and so I think there's a lesson there for many other countries.
That is the story of solar, really. Big state action by Germany for feed-in tariff of a green coalition in 2001, which led to massive demand, drove down the price. We're about to have another green coalition, it looks like, in Germany. We'll see what that brings. And then in China, picked it up, and with massive procurement drove the price, everyone benefits. Of course, we're seeing this in electric vehicles now. That's part of what's happening. China's drive for electric vehicles. And then it looks like hydrogen, this could happen, because if we dramatically reduce the cost of hydrogen and increase the volume, it opens up shipping, green ammonia from green hydrogen, aviation, steel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that part of the discussion? Are you seeing that discussion going on?
Absolutely. And again, we've got, in fact, because we wanted to really get this forensic focus on a midterm goal, we helped convene and launch the Green Hydrogen Catapult, which is now up and running, and which is focused on getting down to $2 a kilogram by 2026. And you may have seen the DOE, the Department of Energy in the States, has launched its hydrogen Earthshot. And I think we'll see more of them focused on getting the cost down to $1 by 2030. That's the trajectory, right? Which is why I think anybody promoting blue hydrogen at the moment is playing a kind of a king Canute game, because it's going to be out. Blue hydrogen is going to be outcompeted so quickly, and it will be more expensive because because you've got this added cost of CCS. It just seems to me rather silly economically to bet on that when it's really rather obvious where hydrogen is going. And there's some big money going in now. You see countries like Chile recognizing they've got a competitive advantage. Australia, despite being a laggard at the federal level, there's big money going into Western Australia, huge renewable plus hydrogen projects. So I think this at last, I think it's the third time that hydrogen's been the future. But I think all the analysis shows that sort of 10-15% of global energy demand by 2050 will have to be provided by green hydrogen, because there are some processes that we don't have any visibility of a way to electrify them, and so the only way, as you mentioned, three of them, right? Shipping, aviation, and long distance shipping, aviation, and steel. So yeah,
it's pretty exciting, isn't it? That you can actually just feel this is possible now in a way that 3 years ago was looking very academic. It's sort of like a pandemic dividend, I have to say. That is, whether that's the case or not. I'm just talking about time.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly, I took on this role just as we were going into the first lockdown. I managed to have a couple of meetings in February last year, my first month, and then was locked down. So Gonzalo Munoz is the Chilean high-level champion who we worked very closely together. We met in February last year, and then June this year. Those are the second time. It's crazy, but we have been really surprised. I don't know whether it's because of the pandemic or whether it would have happened anyway or faster, but certainly we thought that the pandemic might really slow momentum down, and it hasn't, in terms of the level of commitment and increasingly the level of clarity about what we need to do in this decade.
The pandemic, of course, brutal as it has been and still is in so many parts of the world, is linked to environmental degradation, biodiversity collapse, and so on, as we know, zoonotic diseases. And in that sense is linked to the need to think about resilience in the context of the climate challenges we face. So the resilience is more than just coastal protection, it's also social, economic, and biodiversity resilience. How much of that is on the agenda in your talking? Have people picked up that adequately? Do you think the connections are being made?
I think still not enough. I mean, there's this sort of traditional structure of the Paris agreements: mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and finance. And mitigation has always kind of raced ahead. I think that's because of all sorts of structural biases in the global economy and politics. Interestingly, I mean, we're doing a lot on resilience. That's why I mentioned I'm going to visit some small island states soon. They're the one. If anyone is worried about resilience, it's people who are having more and more hurricanes and rising sea levels who haven't got high land to go to. Actually, sometimes I think that that resilience is the real issue. And mitigation is one of the pathways to resilience. You could almost invert the thinking, saying, we've got to because it's ultimately all about resilience of human life, of economies, of communities, and we have to both get down to zero as fast as possible and do other things like pay attention to the labour transition,
The just transition.
So pay attention to it, make sure work towards a just transition. I think, and also I think we have to really look at global solidarity much more than we are now. When the gavel came down in the Paris Agreement, there was a palpable sense in the room of global solidarity, and I think that that really needs to be rebuilt, as you say. It's starting to feel like we're moving into post-COVID in the UK, but in many parts of the world, we're right in the middle of it with very low vaccination levels and lots of massive economic damage still. And there's huge inequity in the COVID recoveries and in the climate impacts. So I actually think that geopolitically, as we get more and more clarity on the mitigation transition, and so it becomes a competitive race, the geopolitical issues will be more about equity and resilience and global solidarity. And there I think we've got some way to go.
A very interesting point. It's hard to see how we can survive the kind of crises that come with even moderate climate change without greater solidarity and greater global cooperation, which sort of brings me to my final point, Nigel, because I know our time's running out, is the opportunity for collaboration that seems to flow. Your thoughts about this from the 2030 commitment. The climate summit earlier this year that President Biden held was pretty unusual in the fact that all the major economies came together with strong 2030 commitments, right? That's unprecedented. That is new, totally new. And that would suggest that opens up a window, I'm going to call it a green window for our purposes, for collaboration around how do we achieve the climate change, industrial collaboration, trade collaboration, goodness knows what. What do you think the prospects are there?
Well, I think that, we're not going to stop competing, and we need much more collaboration. So the question is, how do we get the right recipe of collaboration and competition, right? So, for example, I think as shipping I talked about earlier, and we can learn here from industries that regularly go through much faster transition. So the tech industry have this idea of, in our phones, like we're now migrating from 4G to 5G. We don't even think about that. It's just a better phone, right? And it's got more functionality. But engineers pre-competitively decided a long time ago what the 5th generation was going to be. They've already defined 6G. They're working on 7G. So that you can, but they compete like mad to actually deliver the products to customers. So I think, I think we need to have a more mature understanding of the relationship between. I've always felt that collaboration is too easily dismissed, whereas actually nearly all human endeavors rely on massive collaboration around unwritten rules, sort of decent behavior and sharing of information. And I think we have this sort of slightly sort of social Darwinist myth that it's all about competition. So, and this solidarity will only happen with collaboration. So collaboration about the major milestones, so net zero and these sort of halving by 2030, that's collaboration. I think the big area we need to collaboration is how do we mobilize finance in emerging markets, so that, because this is the fundamental climate equity issue, is that rich countries all got to develop on the back of fossil fuels. Now we need to develop, and we don't see a pathway without more collaboration. So, increasingly, I think I've just written something. I think that this is like a post-war moment. It's kind of economic chaos, massive joblessness, very unfairly distributed impacts of COVID. If you take the two analogies of the two world wars last century, there's a Versailles response to a post-war reconstruction, and there's the Marshall Plan response. The first response looks inwards, is selfish, tries to get as much out of other people as possible, sows the seeds, as Keynes famously wrote, for the rise of fascism and the collapse of civilization. And then there's the Marshall Plan response, which says, this is a non-zero-sum game. By helping others, we build a bigger pot for us to thrive, and we also create the conditions for peace rather than conflict. That, I think, is what the next couple of years are going to be around. We're going to go Versailles or Marshall, and that will dictate the shape of the global economy in the next 20 years, and global solidarity or not.
Nigel, what a fantastic way to end. Versailles or post-World War II, Bretton Woods, Paris, etc. Clearly that's the way we're going to go, but we've still got to do a bit of work to get there.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for your words. And can I say good luck on this mission to create the new world order, the post-pandemic, like the post-World War II order, because this is what we need. It's so important.
Well, thanks, Sean. And it's great to talk with you. And the thing I'd say is this, this is the most privileged role I've ever had in my life, because I'm working with so many amazing people who are working towards a better world. Your present company very much included. So thanks for everything that you and your colleagues have done. And 2 trillion sounds like a pretty big benchmark. When do you say we're going to get there? 2 trillion of issued green bonds?
Sometime the next 12 months.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I was hoping to get there for the COP, but I'm going to have to settle for about 1.6 trillion.
Okay, still already materials. Amazing.
We're doing well.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Nigel. Thank you for the talk. And to the next session.
Yeah.